Mardi Gras explodes not with celebration, but gunfire. Amina Cole, fighting for justice after her sister Tasha's death, faces a nightmare far deeper than she imagined. Her resurrected sister isn't seeking peace. She's delivering vengeance against the architects of a dark conspiracy called Project Phoenix. As secrets unravel and loyalties shatter amidst the chaos of New Orleans, can Amina expose the truth and save what's left of her family, or will sacrifice be the final price? The apartment smelled like stale coffee and unwashed grief. Amina Cole sat cross-legged on her threadbare rug, phone trembling in her hand as if it knew what she was about to do. Outside, New Orleans hummed its usual jazz-fueled chaos, trumpets wailing, laughter spilling from bars. But inside this dimly lit space, there was only silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. Her fingers hovered over the record button. She could feel the weight of blood drying on her palms, sticky and accusing. It wasn't hers. "They killed my sister," she whispered, testing the words. They came out raw, jagged edges slicing through the quiet. She tried again, louder this time. "They killed my sister." Her face filled the screen now, framed by the soft glow of a single overhead bulb. Shadows pooled beneath her eyes, dark enough to swallow light whole. Her hair, usually braided tight against her scalp, spilled loose around her shoulders, unruly and wild, like her thoughts. Behind her, the wall bore faint scuffs where her fist had met plaster earlier. A futile attempt to release the storm brewing inside her. She took a shaky breath. "My name is Amina Cole. My little sister, Tasha. They shot her. For no reason. For nothing." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she clenched her jaw so hard it hurt. Tears blurred the camera lens, but she didn't wipe them away. Let people see her cry. Let them see how much this hurt. Amina leaned closer, her scarred ear brushing the phone's edge. That scar, a map of Africa etched into skin, souvenir of a childhood accident, seemed to pulse under the harsh light. She had hated it once, back when she thought ugliness mattered. Now it felt like armor, a reminder of survival. "Listen to me," she said, voice steadying despite the tremor in her hands. "If you're watching this, I need your help. They won't listen to us. Not unless we make them." For a moment, she hesitated. Was this stupid? Naive? Would anyone even care? But then she remembered Tasha lying on the pavement, life leaking out of her in thick crimson rivers while cops shouted orders and bystanders filmed instead of helping. No one had helped. Not even Amina, who had been too late, always too late. So she pressed record. It happened less than 24 hours ago, though it already felt like another lifetime. Amina had been at home, nursing a glass of bourbon and scrolling through social media, when her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Caller ID read Tasha. Strange, her sister rarely called anymore. They drifted apart after their mother died, Tasha retreating into herself while Amina threw herself into activism work. Still, blood was blood. She answered without thinking. "Hey, baby girl. What's up?" Tasha's voice was tight, nervous. "I'm in trouble, Mina. Can you come get me?" "What kind of trouble?" Amina asked, sitting up straighter. Trouble meant anything from unpaid parking tickets to skipped rent payments. With Tasha, you never knew. "I got pulled over," Tasha said quickly. "Some cop saying I ran a red light, but I swear I didn't." "Where are you?" Amina interrupted, grabbing her keys. "Corner of Claiborne and St. Anne." "I'm coming." But by the time Amina arrived, flashing lights painted the intersection in angry hues of blue and red. Officers surrounded Tasha's car, guns drawn. Amina screamed her sister's name, pushing through the crowd, but no one listened. No one ever did. Then came the gunshot. One sharp crack, followed by silence so profound it seemed to stop time itself. When Amina finally reached Tasha's side, her sister lay sprawled across the hood of her car, eyes wide open, staring at something Amina couldn't see. Blood. So much blood. And just like that, Tasha was gone. Back in the present, Amina ended the recording with shaking hands. She uploaded the video to every platform she could think of, tagging activists, journalists, anyone who might amplify her voice. Then she collapsed onto the floor, chest heaving, and let the sobs come. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she watched as the internet exploded. Hashtags trended. Hashtag Justice for Tasha, hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag Say Her Name. Protest plans circulated. Strangers sent messages of support or vitriol depending on which corner of the web they inhabited. By morning, the video had millions of views, but something gnawed at Amina, a feeling she couldn't quite name. Fear? Guilt? Or maybe it was the creeping certainty that speaking out would cost her everything. At 8:03 a.m., Amina stepped outside to grab the newspaper. The air smelled faintly of rain, heavy and metallic, clinging to her skin like a warning. She glanced down the street, half expecting to see reporters camped out or protesters gathering. But the neighborhood seemed eerily quiet. When she returned to her apartment, the door was slightly ajar. She froze, heart pounding. Had she forgotten to lock it? Slowly, she pushed it open wider. The place was empty. Too empty. Her laptop was gone, along with her purse and phone charger. On the kitchen counter sat a note. "You should have stayed quiet." Before she could process what it meant, strong arms grabbed her from behind. A cloth pressed against her mouth, sweet-smelling and suffocating. Darkness closed in. When Amina came to, she was somewhere cold and sterile. Light seeped through cracks in the ceiling, casting strange shadows on the walls. Her head throbbed, and her throat burned like sandpaper. "Hello?" she croaked, voice hoarse. No answer. Panic bubbled up, sharp and acidic. Where was she? Who had taken her? And why? As if in response, a disembodied voice crackled through hidden speakers. "Welcome, Ms. Cole. You've made quite the impression." Amina's stomach dropped. This wasn't random. Whoever had her knew exactly who she was and what she stood for. As the voice continued taunting her, Amina realized something chilling. They weren't just punishing her. They were using her as bait. Somewhere out there, thousands of people were rallying in her name, unaware that their movement was walking straight into a trap, and she was powerless to stop it. By noon, the streets of New Orleans were alive, not with music or revelry, but with rage. Thousands poured into Claiborne Avenue, where Tasha Cole had been shot, carrying signs scrawled with defiant messages. "Stop killing us. Justice for Tasha. Black Lives Matter." The air crackled with tension, thick enough to choke on. Amina's video had spread like wildfire, igniting a movement that felt both spontaneous and inevitable. Protesters chanted her name alongside Tasha's, their voices rising above the hum of traffic and the wail of distant sirens. For many, Amina wasn't just a grieving sister. She was a symbol, a woman brave enough to scream into the void and demand answers. But bravery came at a cost. As the crowd swelled, police arrived in riot gear, forming a barricade at the edge of the protest. Their faces were hidden behind helmets and visors, anonymous and untouchable. Through megaphones, they ordered the demonstrators to disperse. No one moved. Then came the tear gas. Clouds of acrid smoke billowed through the streets, sending people stumbling backward, coughing and crying. Rubber bullets ricocheted off pavement, striking those who refused to retreat. Chaos erupted as protesters scattered, only to regroup moments later, angrier than before. Fires sprang up. Trash cans, abandoned cars, even storefronts burned bright against the gray sky. The city trembled under the weight of its own history. Across town, Daniel Hart sat in his office, staring at the blinking light on his phone. He'd ignored it for hours, knowing exactly who it would be. But now curiosity or guilt got the better of him. He pressed play. "Amina Cole's missing," said a clipped voice on the other end. "We need you to represent Officer Grayson." Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. Of course they'd call him. They always did when things got messy. As one of the few white lawyers willing to take on cases involving racial injustice, he'd earned a reputation for being impartial, if not outright sympathetic, to marginalized communities. It made him valuable to powerful people who wanted to appear progressive without actually changing anything. But this time felt different. He glanced at the framed photo on his desk. Himself and Amina, 10 years younger, standing outside a courthouse after winning a landmark discrimination lawsuit. Back then, they believed they could change the world together. Back then, they loved each other. Now he wasn't sure what they were, or if they were anything at all. Their relationship hadn't ended with a bang, but with a slow unraveling. It started with debates over strategy, arguments about whether incremental reform could ever truly dismantle systemic oppression. Amina wanted revolution. Daniel preferred negotiation. She saw compromise as betrayal. He saw radicalism as reckless. One night, during a particularly heated discussion, Amina had slammed her fist on the table, eyes blazing. "You don't understand because you'll never have to," she spat. "They don't see you the way they see me. You can walk away anytime you want. And what does that make me?" Daniel shot back, hurt flashing across his face. "Just some token ally?" "Yes," she shouted, though her voice softened immediately. "No, I don't know. But it's not the same, Daniel. It will never be the same." They broke up shortly after, unable to reconcile their differences. Yet Daniel still carried her words with him, a constant reminder of the privilege he couldn't unsee, and the responsibility he couldn't escape. Against his better judgment, Daniel decided to attend the protest. Not as a lawyer, but as an observer. He needed to understand what was happening. Not just legally, but emotionally. What drove people to risk arrest, injury, even death for the sake of a cause? When he arrived, the scene hit him like a punch to the gut. Flames licked the night sky, casting flickering shadows on buildings scarred by graffiti. Chants echoed through the streets, rhythmic and relentless. "No justice, no peace. Say her name, Tasha Cole." Daniel spotted a group of teenagers spray painting murals on boarded-up windows. One depicted Amina holding a megaphone, her face fierce and unyielding. Beneath it, someone had written, "Her silence is our silence." His chest tightened. Where was she? And why did it feel like her disappearance wasn't random? As the evening wore on, tensions escalated. Police advanced, batons raised, forcing protesters back toward the French Quarter. Bottles flew, shattering against shields. Someone threw a Molotov cocktail, igniting a dumpster. Smoke mingled with the smell of charred wood and spilled liquor, creating a toxic haze. Amid the chaos, Daniel noticed a figure standing apart from the crowd. A man in a dark suit, watching silently. His posture was too deliberate, his gaze too calculating. Something about him screamed authority. Daniel approached cautiously. "Who are you?" The man turned, revealing sharp features and cold eyes. "Mr. Hart," he said, unsurprised. "I've been expecting you." Before Daniel could respond, the man handed him a flash drive. "This might interest you," he murmured, then melted into the crowd before Daniel could ask questions. Later, in the safety of his car, Daniel plugged the drive into his laptop. Files upon files appeared, labeled with cryptic names. Project Phoenix, Subject Alpha, Operation Mardi Gras. At first glance, they seemed unrelated to the protests or to Amina, but deep down, Daniel knew better. Nothing about this was coincidence. As Daniel drove home, his mind raced with possibilities. Whoever had taken Amina wasn't acting alone. They were part of something bigger, something sinister, and somehow he was tied to it. On the radio, a news anchor announced that authorities had launched a citywide manhunt for Amina, claiming she posed a threat to public safety. Daniel clenched the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "They're lying," he muttered to himself. But why? And more importantly, what role would he play in uncovering the truth or burying it? When Amina opened her eyes again, she was alone, or so it seemed. The room hadn't changed. Cold, sterile, devoid of windows or furniture save for a single chair bolted to the floor. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made the space feel smaller than it already was. Her head throbbed where they'd injected her, a dull ache pulsing behind her temples. She tried to sit up but found her wrists bound to metal loops embedded in the wall. Panic surged through her veins, sharp and electric, but she forced herself to breathe. She couldn't afford to lose control. Not here, not now. A voice crackled through hidden speakers, distorted and mechanical. "Good morning, Miss Cole." She flinched, heart hammering against her ribs. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice raw from disuse. "What do you want?" The voice ignored her question. Instead, it continued in an almost conversational tone, as though discussing the weather. "You've caused quite a stir out there. Your video, impressive work. But I'm afraid your audience won't be hearing from you anytime soon." Amina swallowed hard, bile rising in her throat. "Why are you doing this?" "Because," the voice said softly, almost kindly, "you're special, Amina. More than you realize." Hours stretched into days or maybe minutes. Time lost all meaning in the absence of natural light. Meals arrived sporadically, slid through a slot in the door without warning. Sometimes it was just water and stale bread. Other times, nutrient shakes that tasted like chalk. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but thirst was worse. It left her lips cracked and her tongue thick, making speech difficult. Sleep eluded her. When exhaustion finally claimed her, nightmares took over. Visions of Tasha lying lifeless on the hood of her car, blood pooling around her body. In one particularly vivid dream, Amina reached out to touch her sister's face, only to find it crumbling beneath her fingers like ash. When she woke screaming, the voice returned. "Do you miss her?" it asked almost tenderly. "Your sister? Such a tragedy. And yet here you are, still fighting." "Go to hell," Amina rasped, tears streaming down her cheeks. The response came immediately, chilling in its calmness. "Oh, my dear, we're already there." On the third day, or what felt like the third day, guards entered the room. Two men, both masked, dragged her to her feet and forced her onto the chair. Her legs buckled beneath her, weakened by days of immobility, but they held her upright. One of them pressed a button on a small device, sending a jolt of electricity coursing through her body. Pain exploded in her chest, stealing her breath. She screamed until her throat burned, until black spots danced across her vision. And then, somehow, amidst the agony, a song rose unbidden to her lips. "Which side are you on, my people? Which side are you on?" She sang in Wolof, the language of her ancestors, her voice trembling but defiant. The melody filled the room, soft and haunting, weaving through the sterile air like smoke. For a moment, the guards hesitated, unsure how to respond to this act of rebellion. Then one of them backhanded her, splitting her lip. Blood trickled down her chin, metallic and warm. But Amina kept singing. Later, when the guards had left and the pain had dulled to a manageable ache, Amina noticed something new in the room. A voodoo doll lying on the floor. Its stitched mouth was open in a silent scream, its limbs contorted unnaturally. Around its neck hung a tiny locket engraved with the letter P. She stared at it, wary. Was it a message? A threat? Or something else entirely? Her fingers brushed the doll's coarse fabric as she picked it up, Inside the locket, she found a scrap of paper bearing a series of numbers. July 14th, 23. Coordinates? A date? She tucked the note into her bra, determined to decipher its meaning later. That night, unable to sleep, she replayed the events leading up to her abduction. Who had taken her? Why? And what did they mean when they called her special? Then it hit her. A memory buried deep in her subconscious. Years ago, her mother had whispered stories about children chosen for greatness. Cryptic tales of experiments and promises of empowerment. At the time, Amina had dismissed them as folklore. Now she wasn't so sure. As days passed, Amina began noticing patterns in her captors' behavior. They never spoke directly to her unless necessary, relying instead on pre-recorded messages played through the speakers. Occasionally, she caught snippets of their conversations outside the door, fragments of words like phoenix, genetics, and elite. But the most disturbing revelation came during another interrogation session. This time, they didn't ask questions. Instead, they showed her footage of protests raging across New Orleans, protesters chanting her name. Fires burned in the streets, police clashed with demonstrators, and banners bore her face alongside Tasha's. "You see," the voice said, dripping with satisfaction, "you're inspiring chaos, destruction, and we can't have that, can we?" Amina glared at the screen, defiance blazing in her eyes. "They'll keep fighting," she spat. "With or without me." The voice chuckled darkly. "Ah, but that's where you're wrong, Miss Cole. You're not just a symbol, you're the key. Without you, the movement falls apart." Late one night, as silence enveloped the room, Amina noticed faint scratches on the wall beside her cot. They were barely visible, etched into the paint with deliberate care. Words formed slowly as she traced them with trembling fingers. "Trust no one. Look for the map." Amina's pulse quickened. Someone else had been here before her, and whoever it was, they wanted her to escape. But first, she needed to understand the game being played, and she was running out of time. Daniel sat hunched over his laptop in the dim light of his apartment, the glow of the screen casting sharp shadows across his face. He had spent hours poring over the files from the flash drive, each revelation more unsettling than the last. What began as vague references, Project Phoenix, Subject Alpha, Operation Mardi Gras, crystallized into something far darker. A covert experiment aimed at creating genetically engineered elite, black individuals capable of influencing public opinion on behalf of shadowy corporate interests. The details were chilling. Subject profiles included psychological evaluations, genetic markers, and behavioral data. One file caught his attention, a photo labeled Subject P7. It was Amina. His breath hitched as he zoomed in on her image. Her scarred ear, her defiant gaze. It was unmistakably her. Beneath her photo, notes described her as highly resilient, charismatic, and ideologically volatile. There was even mention of her mother's involvement in preliminary phases of the project decades earlier. "God damn it," Daniel muttered, running a hand through his hair. How had he not seen this before? He'd worked briefly with Project Phoenix early in his career, believing it to be a legitimate effort to empower marginalized communities. Now he understood its true purpose: control disguised as progress. A text message buzzed on his phone, pulling him from his thoughts. It was unsigned, reading simply, "Meet me at Café Beignet, midnight. Come alone." Café Beignet was quiet this late, its wrought iron chairs stacked neatly atop marble tables. Only one other patron occupied the space, a woman seated near the back, nursing a cup of coffee. As Daniel approached, she looked up, revealing familiar features framed by silver-streaked braids. "Mayor Renee Dubois." "Mr. Hart," she said smoothly, gesturing for him to sit. "I trust you've been busy." Daniel hesitated but complied. "Madam Mayor." To what do I owe the pleasure? Dubois leaned forward, her polished demeanor masking something predatory. Let's cut to the chase, shall we? You've been digging where you shouldn't. I don't know what you're talking about, Daniel lied, though his pulse quickened. Oh, come now. We both know you've accessed classified information. Information that could destabilize everything we've built here in New Orleans. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Including your precious Ms. Cole. The mention of Amina sent a jolt through him. Where is she? Dubois smiled thinly. Safe, for now. But her continued safety depends entirely on you. What do you want? Daniel asked, his voice low and controlled despite the storm raging inside him. Cooperation, she replied. Represent Officer Grayson. Keep the protests contained. And above all, stay out of matters that don't concern you. And if I refuse? Her smile widened, cold and calculating. Then I'll make sure Amina's fate becomes permanent. To understand why Daniel felt such personal guilt about Project Phoenix, one needed only to look at his past. Raised in a foster care system designed to rehabilitate children deemed troubled, Daniel had been part of an experimental program aimed at integrating white orphans into predominantly black households. The goal, officials claimed, was to promote racial harmony. In reality, it was another layer of social engineering, one that left Daniel perpetually torn between identities he never fully belonged to. He remembered the first time he met Amina during a civil rights case years ago. She'd taken one look at him and said, "You're not one of us, are you?" It stung not because it was untrue, but because it revealed how deeply she understood the complexities of belonging. Over time, they found common ground in their shared fight against injustice, but their differences eventually drove them apart. Now, staring at Mayor Dubois, Daniel realized how much of his life had been shaped by these experiments. Had he truly chosen his path, or had he been manipulated into playing a role dictated by others? After leaving the cafe, Daniel followed an anonymous tip leading him to an abandoned plantation outside the city. Overgrown vines clawed at crumbling brick walls, and Spanish moss draped eerily from ancient oak trees. The air smelled of decay and history, heavy with ghosts of the past. Inside, he discovered remnants of recent activity. Discarded syringes, medical equipment, and documents bearing the Project Phoenix insignia. Among them was a blueprint of underground tunnels connecting the plantation to forgotten cemeteries used during slavery. Notes scribbled in the margins referenced containment cells and behavioral conditioning. As Daniel sifted through the evidence, a single phrase repeated itself in his mind. She'll do perfectly. They weren't just experimenting on Amina. They were using her as bait to dismantle the Black Lives Matter movement. Anger surged within him, hot and consuming. He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palms. If he exposed this, he risked destroying everything, including himself. But staying silent meant betraying Amina, and that was unthinkable. Before leaving the plantation, Daniel noticed a photograph tucked beneath a pile of papers. It showed Amina standing beside Mayor Dubois at a charity gala, their smiles frozen in time. On the back, someone had scrawled a cryptic message. The puppeteer always wears a mask. Daniel's blood ran cold. If Dubois was involved, she wasn't acting alone. Someone else, someone powerful, pulled the strings, and whoever it was, they knew exactly how to hurt him. Amina's mind was a labyrinth, twisting and turning with memories she couldn't untangle. In the suffocating silence of her cell, she clung to fragments of her childhood like lifelines, threads of a past that felt increasingly distant yet achingly vivid. Her mother's voice echoed loudest. "You girls are special," she would whisper late at night, brushing Amina's hair as they sat together on the porch. Not everyone understands what it means to be chosen. At the time, Amina had dismissed those words as bedtime stories meant to soothe restless children. But now, trapped in this sterile room with nothing but her thoughts, She wondered if there had been truth buried beneath the myth. She remembered one particular evening when her mother pulled out an old photo album. The pictures were faded, their edges curling with age, but the faces stared back at her with unsettling clarity. Men in lab coats stood beside rows of children, all wearing identical uniforms. Beneath the image, someone had written, Phase 1, Genetic Adaptation Trials. What's this? Young Amina had asked, tracing the letters with her finger. Her mother closed the album quickly, her hands trembling. Nothing for you to worry about, baby girl. Just history. But history had a way of catching up. Sleep brought no relief. Instead, it plunged Amina deeper into a dreamscape where reality and illusion blurred. Each night, Tasha appeared to her, not as the lifeless body sprawled across the hood of her car, but alive and whole. Sometimes she smiled, reaching out as if to reassure Amina. Other times, her expression hardened, accusatory. You left me, Dream Tasha said once, her voice hollow. You promised you'd protect me. I tried, Amina pleaded, tears streaming down her face. I swear I tried. Tasha tilted her head, studying her sister with eyes too knowing for someone so young. Did you? Or did you just keep running away? The accusation cut deeper than any blade. Because wasn't that what she'd always done? Run from pain, run from responsibility, run from herself. When she woke, the ache in her chest lingered. Was Tasha truly dead? Or was there more to her story than met the eye? During one interrogation session, the disembodied voice returned, its tone almost gentle. Tell me, Amina, do you ever wonder why you survived when others didn't? She stiffened, refusing to engage. But the question lingered, worming its way into her consciousness. Later, while examining the voodoo doll again, she noticed something new, a hidden compartment sewn into its base. Inside, she found another scrap of paper bearing a single word, hybrid. The term sent a shiver down her spine. Hybrid of what? Of whom? That night, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, pieces began falling into place. Her mother's cryptic warnings, the experiments referenced in the files Daniel uncovered, the strange comments from her captors about her being special. It hit her then, like a punch to the gut. Project Phoenix wasn't just about manipulating public opinion. It was about creating a new kind of leader, one who could bridge divides, command loyalty, and embody resilience. Leaders like her and Tasha, Amina's scar, the map of Africa etched into her skin, had always been a reminder of survival. As a child, she hated it, covering it with bandages or long hair whenever possible. But over time, it became a symbol of strength, proof that she could endure even the deepest wounds. Now, as she traced its outline with trembling fingers, she realized how much it represented. Not just her heritage, but her humanity. They could take everything else away, her freedom, her voice, her dignity, but they couldn't erase who she was. She thought of Lucille Clifton's poem, Won't You Celebrate With Me? What did I see to be except myself? I made it up here alone. The lines resonated deeply, echoing her own journey towards self-discovery. She might have been shaped by forces beyond her control, but she was still hers, still whole. Even in captivity, she refused to let them break her spirit. Her resolve was tested daily. Guards subjected her to sensory deprivation, leaving her blindfolded and gagged for hours at a time. When they finally removed the restraints, she was disoriented, unable to tell whether minutes or days had passed. Then came the injections, clear liquids pumped into her veins without explanation. At first, they induced hallucinations, visions of her mother standing at the foot of her bed, urging her to fight. Flashes of Tasha laughing as they played tag in the backyard. Over time, the effects worsened, plunging her into paranoia and despair. One particularly harrowing episode left her convinced she was drowning. Water filled her lungs, choking her, dragging her under. She clawed at her throat, screaming until her voice gave out. When she finally surfaced, gasping for air, she realized it had all been in her head, but the fear remained. As dawn broke, or what Amina assumed was dawn, based on the faint shift in light, she heard footsteps approaching. Not the heavy boots of guards, but lighter, softer steps. Someone whispered her name, barely audible above the hum of fluorescent lights. Amina! Her heart leapt. Could it be Tasha? Alive? Before she could respond, the door creaked open. A figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the dim glow. For a split second, she thought she saw her sister's face. But then the figure raised a gun, aiming directly at her. "Who sent you?" Amina demanded, her voice shaking despite her attempt at bravery. The figure didn't answer. Instead, they fired. Pain exploded in her shoulder, sharp and searing. Darkness closed in as she slumped to the floor, clutching the wound. Through the haze, she heard a familiar voice murmur, "This isn't over," and then silence. The story unfolded in fragments, alternating between two worlds, one bathed in sterile fluorescence, the other steeped in shadowy streets. In her cell, Amina drifted between consciousness and delirium, her wounded shoulder throbbing with every heartbeat. The bullet had grazed her, leaving a jagged gash that bled sluggishly despite her attempts to staunch it with torn strips of fabric from her shirt. She replayed the moment over and over in her mind. The figure stepping into the light, the gun pointed at her chest, the whisper, "This isn't over." Who was it? An ally? Or another pawn in this twisted game? Meanwhile, Daniel prowled the city like a ghost, his mind racing with unanswered questions. After his encounter with Mayor Dubois, he'd redoubled his efforts to uncover the truth about Project Phoenix. Each clue led him further down a rabbit hole of corruption, connecting powerful oil tycoons to urban development schemes targeting impoverished neighborhoods. The protests weren't just about justice for Tasha, they were pawns in a larger power play. As their paths remained separated, memories bound them together. Both found themselves haunted by ghosts, literal and metaphorical, that refused to be silenced. Daniel returned to Amina's childhood home, now abandoned and decaying. Vines snaked through shattered windows, and paint peeled from warped wooden walls. It felt wrong to trespass here, but something drew him back. A need to understand who Amina truly was beneath the scarred exterior she showed the world. Inside, he found remnants of her life scattered like debris after a storm. Photographs lined the mantelpiece, their glass frames cracked but intact enough to reveal smiling faces frozen in time. One picture caught his eye. Amina and Tasha as children, arms slung around each other's shoulders, grinning wide under the Louisiana sun. Behind them stood their mother, her expression serene yet guarded, as if she carried secrets too heavy to share. On the floor near an overturned desk, he discovered a stack of old letters tied with yellowed ribbon. They were addressed to Amina's mother from someone named Dr. Marcus Hale, whose name triggered a flicker of recognition in Daniel's mind. As he sifted through the pages, snippets of conversation leapt out. The subjects are responding well to Phase 2. We believe subject P7 shows exceptional promise. Be careful, Evelyn. These people don't care about progress. They care about control. Evelyn, Amina's mother. So she had known. All those whispered warnings, cryptic stories about special children. They hadn't been folklore. They'd been truths wrapped in lies. Daniel sank onto the dusty floor, clutching the letters tightly. How many lives had been destroyed in the name of progress? And how many more would fall before this nightmare ended? To make sense of the present, Daniel revisited the past. He spent hours poring over archives detailing the 1898 Wilmington insurrection, the first successful coup d'etat in American history. White supremacists had overthrown the elected multiracial government of Wilmington, North Carolina, killing dozens of black citizens and forcing thousands to flee. What struck him most was how seamlessly the violence had been justified, framed as necessary to restore order, protect property, and uphold white supremacy. It mirrored what was happening now. Protests labeled riots, activists branded terrorists, communities displaced in the name of urban renewal. History didn't repeat itself, it rhymed. As he read accounts of black leaders betrayed by those they trusted, he couldn't help but think of Mayor Renee Dubois. Her polished speeches about equality and progress masked darker allegiances to oil tycoons eager to demolish low-income housing and gentrify neighborhoods. She wasn't just complicit, she was orchestrating. But why target Amina specifically? And where did Tasha fit into all this? Back in her cell, Amina wrestled with doubts that gnawed at her resolve. Who could she trust? Was anyone coming for her? The gunshot wound throbbed mercilessly, a constant reminder of vulnerability. She pressed her forehead against the cold wall, trying to steady her breathing. Her thoughts turned to Daniel. Had he seen her video? Did he even care anymore? Their relationship had always been fraught with tension, his pragmatism clashing with her idealism. But there had been love once. Real love. Could it survive betrayal? Then came anger. If Daniel knew anything about Project Phoenix, and she suspected he did, he owed her answers. He owed her action. Not empty words or half-hearted gestures, but real, tangible effort to tear down the systems crushing them both. She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms. Survival wasn't enough. She needed justice. Daniel arranged another meeting with Mayor Dubois, this time on his terms. He chose a secluded park bench overlooking the Mississippi River, where the water churned restlessly, reflecting the turmoil within him. "You're playing a dangerous game," Dubois began, her voice smooth as silk. "I warned you to stay out of this, and I warned you not to underestimate me," Daniel countered, sliding a folder across the bench. Inside were copies of the letters he'd found at Amina's house, along with evidence linking Dubois to Project Phoenix and its corporate backers. Dubois scanned the documents, her composure slipping ever so slightly. "Where did you get these?" "It doesn't matter," Daniel said evenly. "What matters is what happens next. You can either cooperate or watch everything collapse." For a moment, silence hung between them, broken only by the distant cry of a ship's horn. Then Dubois leaned back, exhaling sharply. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. Enlighten me." She hesitated, weighing her options. Finally, she spoke. "Project Phoenix isn't just about genetic engineering. It's about creating leaders who can navigate chaos without losing sight of priorities." "What kind of priorities?" Daniel demanded. "Control," she admitted quietly. "Order, stability, things you wouldn't understand unless you've lived through chaos yourself." He stared at her, incredulous. "You think oppression is stability?" "I think survival requires sacrifice," she shot back. "Ask your friend Amina. Ask her how far she's willing to go to save her people." The implication hit him like a punch to the gut. Whatever they planned for Amina, it wasn't rescue, it was annihilation. As Daniel left the park, his phone buzzed with an incoming message. It contained a single image: Amina lying unconscious on a hospital bed, monitors beeping around her. Beneath it, text read, "Make your move, Mr. Hart. Time's running out." Daniel froze, dread pooling in his stomach. Whoever sent this wasn't bluffing. Amina's life and countless others depended on his next decision. And deep down, he feared it might already be too late. Protesters filled the streets of New Orleans once more, their numbers swelling with each passing hour. At the heart of the movement stood a new symbol, a voodoo doll bearing Amina's scarred face stitched onto its fabric. It had appeared overnight, pinned to banners and carried aloft like a talisman. No one knew who had created it, but its message was clear. Amina Cole wasn't just missing. She was being silenced. For centuries, voodoo had been dismissed as superstition or exploited for profit by outsiders. But now it became an act of defiance, reclaiming agency in a world determined to strip it away. Protesters adorned themselves with charms and amulets, invoking protection and strength. Chants echoed through the air, blending Creole prayers with calls for justice. Amina, we see you. Tasha, we hear you. Inside her cell, Amina felt the resonance of those voices, faint but unwavering. Her own voodoo doll, the one left deliberately by her captors, sat clutched in her hand. She traced its stitches, finding solace in its imperfections. What had seemed like a cruel taunt now felt like a lifeline. Someone out there understood her pain, and they were fighting back. Using the scraps of paper hidden within the doll, Amina began deciphering the cryptic messages. The coordinates, July 14, 23, pointed to an underground facility beneath St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, a burial ground steeped in history and mystery. It made sense. Enslaved Africans buried here centuries ago had resisted erasure by etching symbols into tombstones, claiming space even in death. But how could she escape? Her captors monitored her every move, feeding her just enough information to keep her compliant without revealing too much. They wanted her alive for now, but that didn't mean she was safe. Then came inspiration. During another hallucination induced by the injections, Amina saw her mother standing beside her, holding up the doll. "Use what they've given you," Evelyn whispered. "Turn their weapons into yours." When clarity returned, Amina examined the doll again. Beneath its base, she found a tiny blade cleverly concealed within the stuffing. Not enough to cut chains, but sufficient for smaller tasks. With trembling hands, she used it to carve lines into the wall near her cot, marking days and mapping patterns in her captors' routines. Escape might still be impossible, but hope wasn't. Above ground, Daniel watched as the protests grew bolder. Activists repurposed abandoned buildings into makeshift headquarters, plastering walls with flyers bearing Amina's image and QR codes linking to her original video. Street artists painted murals depicting her alongside historical figures like Ida B. Wells and Claudette Colvin, framing her disappearance as part of a long legacy of oppression. One mural struck him particularly hard. Titled, "Which Side Are You On?" It showed Amina singing defiantly, her voice rendered in bold strokes of red and gold. Beneath her feet lay shattered chains, while above her head floated ghostly figures, ancestors watching over her struggle. He snapped a photo and sent it to Mayor Dubois with a simple caption, "The people won't stop." Her response arrived moments later. "Then let them burn." Daniel clenched his phone so tightly it nearly cracked. For all her polish and poise, Dubois revealed herself in moments like this, cold, calculating, willing to destroy entire communities to maintain control. And yet, she wasn't acting alone. Someone pulled her strings, someone with deeper pockets and darker ambitions. Back in her cell, Amina waited for the perfect moment. When guards entered to administer another injection, she feigned compliance, letting them strap her to the chair. As they focused on preparing the syringe, she seized her chance, driving the blade into one guard's wrist. He yelped, dropping the needle, giving her just enough time to twist free. Adrenaline surged through her veins as she bolted toward the door, slamming it shut behind her. Alarms blared instantly, echoing through sterile corridors. Footsteps pounded in pursuit, but Amina didn't look back. She followed the map she'd memorized, counting turns until she reached a stairwell leading downward. The air grew colder as she descended, thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Finally, she emerged into a cavernous space lined with rows of caskets, forgotten relics of lives erased. Among them stood crates marked with the Project Phoenix insignia. She grabbed a shard of broken glass from the floor, using it to scratch a message onto the wall. They think they can bury us, but we rise. Then she pressed record on her smuggled phone, capturing everything before slipping away into the shadows. As Amina fled, she reflected on the power of cultural symbols. Voodoo, jazz, poetry. They weren't relics of the past but living traditions that defied erasure. Her ancestors had survived slavery, Jim Crow, and systemic violence not by submitting but by resisting. Every chant, every note, every stitch in the doll carried their legacy forward. Even her scar, the map of Africa etched into her skin, wasn't just a reminder of trauma. It was a declaration. I exist. I endure. In that moment, she understood why her mother had told those stories. Why she had whispered warnings about being special. It wasn't about superiority, it was about responsibility. To carry the weight of history and transform it into something stronger. Amina stumbled out of the underground facility, gasping for fresh air. Above her, the city burned, not with destruction, but with defiance. Protesters flooded the streets, chanting her name, holding signs bearing her face. Somehow, word of her escape had spread faster than she could have imagined. But freedom came at a seasick cost. As she collapsed onto the pavement, exhausted and bleeding, she spotted a figure watching from the crowd. It was Daniel, his expression torn between relief and anguish. Before he could reach her, a gunshot rang out. Chaos erupted as protesters scattered, shielding Amina with their bodies. Through the haze of smoke and screams, she locked eyes with Daniel, mouthing 3 words, "Trust no one," and then darkness claimed her once more. When Amina regained consciousness, she found herself in a safe house, a cramped apartment tucked above a jazz club in Treme. The walls vibrated with the bass line of a live band below, masking any sounds of distress. Someone had cleaned her wounds and dressed them carefully, but her body still ached from the escape. "You're awake," the voice startled her. Turning slowly, she saw a figure step out of the shadows. For a moment, relief washed over her. It was Tasha, her sister, alive and whole, standing right in front of her. But something was off. Tasha's eyes were cold, calculating, devoid of the warmth Amina remembered. Her once bright smile had been replaced by a tight-lipped smirk that didn't reach her face. She wore all black, her movements deliberate and precise, like a predator circling prey. "Tash," Amina whispered, her voice trembling. "Is it really you?" "It's me," Tasha replied, though her tone lacked conviction. Surprised, Amina wanted to throw her arms around her sister, to hold her tight and never let go. But instinct held her back. Something about Tasha felt wrong, like she was wearing a mask that didn't quite fit. "What happened to you?" Amina asked, searching her sister's face for answers. "We thought you were dead." "I was supposed to be," Tasha admitted, her voice flat. "They faked my death, used me as bait to flush you out. But I turned the tables on them." "How?" Tasha hesitated before answering, her expression darkening. "I became what they feared most, an assassin." Over the next hour, Tasha recounted her story in clipped sentences, each word laced with bitterness. After the shooting, she hadn't died. Instead, she'd been taken to a secret medical facility where doctors patched her up and subjected her to months of psychological conditioning. They trained her to become a weapon, programming her to eliminate anyone threatening their agenda. At first, she resisted, clinging to memories of her family and the life she'd left behind. But resistance only brought more pain. Eventually, she surrendered, letting anger consume her until it burned away everything else. When they sent her on her first mission, to infiltrate a rival faction within Project Phoenix, she completed it without hesitation, silencing dissenters with ruthless efficiency. I stopped asking questions, Tasha said, her gaze fixed on the floor. Stopped caring who lived or died. All that mattered was survival. And now, Amina pressed, her heart breaking for the sister she barely recognized. Now I'm done playing their games, Tasha spat, her voice rising. If they want blood, I'll give them blood. Starting with Mayor Dubois. Meanwhile, Daniel navigated his own labyrinth of lies and loyalties. He met Tasha at an abandoned warehouse near the riverfront, her request delivered via encrypted message. Despite his reservations, he agreed to hear her out, partly out of curiosity, partly because he had no other leads. She arrived cloaked in darkness, her silhouette outlined by moonlight streaming through broken windows. Up close, she looked nothing like the vibrant young woman from Amina's stories. This Tasha radiated danger, every movement calculated and controlled. You know why I'm here, she said without preamble. To kill Mayor Dubois, Daniel replied evenly, meeting her gaze. And then what? Become the thing you hate. Tasha laughed bitterly. Don't act like you're better than me, Hart. You've been complicit in this mess since day one. Her words hit their mark, leaving Daniel momentarily speechless. She was right. He'd played along with systems designed to oppress, believing he could change them from within. But how much damage had he caused in the process? I can help you, he said finally, his voice low and urgent. Together, we can expose the truth without more violence. Tasha studied him for a long moment, weighing his sincerity against her instincts. Finally, she nodded. Fine. But if you cross me, I won't hesitate to put a bullet in your head. Back at the safe house, Amina confronted Tasha about her new identity. You're not just killing bad people, Tash, she argued, her voice shaking with emotion. You're becoming one of them. I don't have a choice, Tasha snapped, slamming her fist against the wall. They took everything from us, Mina. Our home, our family, our future. If I have to burn the world down to make them pay, so be it. But at what cost? Amina countered. Violence doesn't fix anything. It just creates more victims. For a moment, Tasha looked like the scared little girl Amina remembered, tears glistening in her eyes. Then the mask slipped back into place, hardening her features. Maybe, she conceded, but it feels good. As dawn broke over New Orleans, Tasha prepared to carry out her plan. Dressed in tactical gear and armed with a silenced pistol, she moved with purpose toward City Hall, where Mayor Dubois would address reporters later that morning. Daniel followed at a distance, torn between stopping her and exposing the truth. His phone buzzed with an incoming message. Choose wisely, 5 Mr. Hart. Lives depend on it. Before he could respond, gunfire erupted in the distance. Panic surged through the streets as protesters scattered, shouting warnings of an attack. Amid the chaos, Daniel spotted Amina running toward him, her face pale with fear. They're using us, she panted, grabbing his arm. All of us, and Tasha's walking straight into their trap. Without another word, they sprinted toward City Hall, praying they weren't already too late. New Orleans pulsed with anticipation as Mardi Gras approached, its streets alive with color and sound. Floats adorned with feathers and beads rolled slowly through the French Quarter, their riders tossing trinkets to crowds below. Yet beneath the revelry lay an undercurrent of unease, palpable enough to make even seasoned locals glance over their shoulders. For Amina, the festival felt like a countdown to catastrophe. Every beat of the Cajun drums, every wail of a saxophone, seemed to echo her racing heart. She moved through the crowd like a shadow, flanked by Daniel and a small group of trusted allies who had sworn to protect her at all costs. Despite their numbers, she felt exposed, like prey waiting to be hunted. Tasha remained absent, though her presence lingered in whispered rumors and fleeting glimpses. Some claimed she'd infiltrated Mayor Dubois's security detail. Others said she was already inside City Hall, biding her time. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. When the moment came, blood would spill. In the hours leading up to the mayor's speech, Amina focused on preparation. Hidden in a rented van parked blocks from City Hall, she reviewed footage captured during her escape from the underground facility. Each frame revealed new details about Project Phoenix: blueprints of containment cells, profiles of key operatives, and encrypted files hinting at corporate backers. Daniel sat beside her, his laptop glowing softly in the dim interior. He cross-referenced the data with evidence he'd gathered independently, piecing together a timeline of corruption that stretched back decades. As he worked, lines from Lucille Clifton's poem, "Won't You Celebrate With Me," echoed in his mind. Come celebrate with me that every day something has tried to kill me and has failed. The words resonated deeply, not just for Amina but for everyone involved in this fight. Survival wasn't victory. It was defiance against forces determined to erase them. Outside, protesters chanted slogans inspired by Amina's video, their voices rising above the din of the parade. Drums pounded in syncopated rhythms, mimicking the heartbeat of a city teetering on the edge of chaos. It was impossible to tell where celebration ended and resistance began. Amina stepped out of the van briefly to clear her head, only to find Tasha standing nearby, partially obscured by the throng of revelers. Her sister wore civilian clothes now, blending seamlessly into the crowd, but her eyes betrayed her intent. Sharp, calculating, unyielding. You shouldn't be here, Amina said, keeping her voice low. It's not safe. Neither is staying silent. Tasha shot back, her tone clipped. I'm ending this today, Amina. Whether you like it or not. That's not your call to make. Amina snapped, frustration bubbling over. Violence won't fix anything. It'll just destroy what little we have left. Tasha laughed bitterly, shaking her head. You still don't get it, do you? There's nothing left to save. They've already taken everything. Before Amina could respond, Daniel appeared behind her, his expression wary. We need to move, he said, glancing between the sisters. Now, for a moment, the three of them stood frozen, locked in a triangle of unresolved tension. Then Tasha turned abruptly, melting into the crowd without another word. Amina watched her go, guilt twisting in her gut like a knife. She's going to get herself killed, she muttered, her voice barely audible. Or worse, Daniel replied grimly. She might take others down with her. City Hall loomed ahead, its grand columns illuminated by floodlights. Protesters ringed the perimeter, holding signs bearing Amina's face alongside slogans like, Justice Now, and Stop the Lies. Police formed barricades around the entrance, their riot gear gleaming ominously under the artificial glow. Mayor Renee Dubois emerged onto the balcony, her polished demeanor masking the storm brewing within. Flanked by bodyguards and corporate sponsors, she addressed the crowd with practiced ease, spinning lies about unity and progress while ignoring the cries for accountability below. As your mayor, she declared, her voice amplified by microphones, I promise to work tirelessly to heal our community and ensure justice prevails. The words rang hollow, met with jeers and boos from the protesters. Someone threw a bottle, shattering against a column mere feet away. Officers raised their batons, preparing to charge. Amid the chaos, Amina climbed onto a makeshift stage erected by activists, clutching a megaphone. Listen to me, she shouted, her voice cutting through the noise. This isn't about justice. It's about control, about silencing us so they can keep profiting off our pain. Her words ignited a spark, spreading like wildfire through the crowd. Protesters surged forward, chanting her name, demanding answers. For a brief moment, hope flickered to life. Then gunfire erupted, As bullets tore through the air, panic swept through the crowd. Amina ducked instinctively, shielding herself with her arms, but her gaze remained fixed on the balcony. Through the haze of smoke and screams, she spotted Tasha stepping out of the shadows, gun in hand. But instead of aiming at Mayor Dubois, Tasha turned toward the corporate sponsors flanking her. Men whose faces Amina recognized from the Project Phoenix files. One by one, they fell, their bodies crumpling to the ground as blood pooled beneath them. "No!" Amina screamed, lunging forward. But before she could reach her sister, a sniper's bullet whizzed past her ear, grazing Daniel's shoulder. He collapsed beside her, clutching the wound as blood seeped through his fingers. "Run!" he gasped, pushing her away. "Go!" But Amina hesitated, torn between saving Daniel and stopping Tasha. In that moment of indecision, she realized the true cost of resistance. No matter what happened next, someone she loved would pay the price. And then the world exploded into chaos. The first shot shattered the illusion of normalcy, sending shockwaves through the crowd gathered around City Hall. Protesters screamed, scattering like leaves caught in a hurricane. Police surged forward, batons raised, while officers stationed on rooftops took aim at anyone who moved too quickly or not quickly enough. Amina stood frozen on the makeshift stage, her megaphone slipping from nerveless fingers. Her eyes locked onto Tasha, who now crouched atop the balcony railing, gun steady in her hands. Each pull of the trigger sent another corporate sponsor tumbling to the ground, their polished suits soaked crimson. Mayor Dubois clutched the edge of the podium, her composure crumbling as chaos erupted around her. "Tasha, stop!" Amina shouted, her voice cracking under the weight of despair. "This isn't justice. It's murder." But Tasha didn't hear or refused to listen. Her focus remained razor-sharp, each movement precise and deliberate. When she finally turned to face Amina, her expression was cold, almost robotic. "Justice doesn't exist," she spat. "Only power." Before Amina could respond, a sniper's bullet whizzed past her head, embedding itself in the wood behind her. Daniel tackled her to the ground just in time, his injured shoulder protesting with every movement. "We need to get out of here," he yelled, dragging her toward cover. "No!" Amina struggled against him, tears streaming down her face. "I can't leave her." "You don't have a choice," Daniel snapped, his voice breaking. "She's already made hers." As the battle raged around them, Amina broke free from Daniel's grasp, sprinting toward the stairs that led up to the balcony. She dodged falling debris and stray bullets, her heart pounding in sync with the relentless drumbeats echoing through the streets. Somewhere in the distance, jazz horns wailed, a mournful dirge for lives lost and dreams destroyed. When she reached the top, Tasha was reloading her weapon, her back to the chaos below. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, two halves of a fractured whole. "You don't have to do this," Amina pleaded, her voice trembling. "Whatever they did to you, we can fix it. Together." Tasha shook her head, lowering the gun slightly. "It's too late for me, Mina. I've gone too far to turn back." "That's not true," Amina insisted, stepping closer despite the danger. "You're still my sister, my family, and I'll carry you if I have to." For the first time since their reunion, Tasha's mask slipped, revealing the scared little girl beneath. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "I'm sorry." Then she raised the gun again, not at Amina, but at Mayor Dubois, who had begun edging toward an escape route. A single shot rang out. Time seemed to freeze as Tasha collapsed, blood blooming across her chest. Behind her stood a figure clad in tactical gear, smoke curling from the barrel of their rifle. Before Amina could react, the figure turned, aiming directly at her. Instinctively, she threw herself in front of Daniel, shielding him with her body. Pain exploded in her side as the bullet tore through flesh and bone, knocking her to the ground. Darkness crept into her vision, but she fought it, clinging to consciousness long enough to press a USB drive into Daniel's hand. "Promise me," she gasped, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. "Promise me you'll finish this." Daniel cradled her in his arms, tears streaming down his face. "I promise," he choked out, clutching the drive tightly. "I promise." Her lips curved into a faint smile before her eyes fluttered closed. The drums faded, replaced by silence so profound it felt like the world itself had stopped breathing. With Amina's death came a surge of determination among the protesters. Videos of Tasha's assassination spread like wildfire, accompanied by Amina's final broadcast naming names and exposing Project Phoenix's architects. The public outcry was immediate and overwhelming, forcing authorities to launch investigations into Mayor Dubois and her corporate backers. Dubois attempted to flee the city but was intercepted by federal agents acting on evidence provided anonymously. Evidence traced back to Daniel Hart. Arrested on charges of conspiracy and corruption, she became a symbol of betrayal, proof that oppression knew no color line. Meanwhile, Tasha's body disappeared shortly after the shooting, spirited away by unknown allies. Rumors circulated that she had survived, though no one dared confirm or deny them. What remained clear was her legacy. A wake-up call to those who believed systemic change could be achieved without dismantling the systems themselves. As dawn broke over New Orleans, Daniel sat alone in his apartment, staring at the USB drive clutched in his hand. On it lay Amina's final message to the world, a manifesto detailing Project Phoenix's atrocities and calling for accountability at every level of society. He opened a blank document on his laptop and began typing, channeling grief into words. Justice isn't winning or losing. It's seeing the darkness within and choosing to step into the light anyway. Outside, the city stirred to life, its rhythms unchanged despite the upheaval. Jazz poured from open windows, mingling with the cries of vendors setting up shop. Life went on as it always did, but for Daniel, nothing would ever be the same. Months passed, but New Orleans bore scars that refused to heal. Murals of Amina Cole adorned walls across the city, her defiant gaze immortalized alongside quotes from her final broadcast. Protesters continued rallying under her name, their chants carrying echoes of her voice. Justice isn't winning or losing. It's seeing the darkness within. For Daniel Hart, life became a series of contradictions. By day, he worked tirelessly to dismantle Project Phoenix, publishing exposés that implicated everyone from Mayor Renee Dubois to shadowy corporate backers. His efforts earned him accolades from activists and journalists alike, cementing his reputation as a crusader against systemic corruption. But by night, he retreated into solitude, haunted by memories of Amina's death and the promise he'd made to honor her legacy. He often visited her grave, a modest plot beneath an ancient oak tree in St. Louis Cemetery No. 1. There, surrounded by weathered tombstones etched with stories of lives erased, he left offerings, flowers, handwritten letters, recordings of jazz songs she'd loved. Each visit felt like a conversation, though the silence never brought closure. One evening, as twilight painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Daniel knelt before her headstone, tracing the inscription with trembling fingers. Amina Cole, beloved sister, fighter, voice of the voiceless. "I tried," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I did what you asked, but it doesn't feel like enough." The wind stirred, rustling leaves above him, and for a moment, he imagined hearing her laughter, the same laugh that had once filled rooms with warmth and light. It was fleeting, gone almost as soon as it arrived, leaving behind only emptiness. Daniel's guilt manifested in ways both subtle and profound. He avoided mirrors, unable to meet his own eyes without seeing accusation staring back. Sleep eluded him, plagued by dreams where Amina reached out, whispering words he couldn't decipher. When he woke, sweat-soaked and gasping for air, he wondered if forgiveness was even possible, or if he deserved it. To cope, he threw himself into activism, organizing rallies and mentoring young leaders inspired by Amina's courage. Yet no matter how many speeches he gave or petitions he signed, the ache inside remained. It wasn't just guilt. It was grief, raw and unrelenting, compounded by the knowledge that he'd failed her when she needed him most. "You can't save everyone," a friend told him once, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Sometimes, all you can do is keep fighting." But Daniel knew better. Fighting wasn't enough, not when the cost was so high. Every victory came at the expense of someone else's loss, and every step forward seemed to unearth new layers of injustice. The system was a hydra. Cut off one head, and two more grew in its place. Still, he pressed on, driven by the memory of Amina's final words, "Promise me you'll finish this." Her voice lingered in his mind, urging him to continue even when hope felt impossibly distant. Though Amina's physical presence was gone, her spirit lived on in those who carried her torch. Activists repurposed abandoned buildings into community centers named after her, offering resources and support to marginalized populations. Street artists painted murals depicting her alongside historical figures like Harriet Tubman and Assata Shakur, framing her struggle as part of a larger continuum of resistance. Her message resonated beyond New Orleans, sparking movements nationwide. Hashtags like #SeeTheDarknessWithin trended globally, inspiring conversations about accountability and complicity. Schools incorporated her story into curricula, teaching students about the power of resilience and the importance of questioning authority. Even Tasha's role in the conspiracy found redemption in hindsight. Though her methods were condemned, her actions forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about privilege and power. Some viewed her as a martyr, others as a cautionary tale, but all agreed she had sparked change, however messy and imperfect. In private moments, Daniel wondered what Amina would think of the world she'd helped shape. Would she see progress, or would she recognize the same cycles repeating themselves under different names? He suspected the latter, though he hoped otherwise. On the anniversary of Amina's death, Daniel attended a memorial service held in Treme, where musicians played somber renditions of jazz standards. As the crowd gathered around a makeshift stage, a poet stepped forward, reciting lines inspired by Lucille Clifton. "Won't you celebrate with me what I have shaped into a kind of life? I had no model. Born in Babylon, both non-white and woman. What did I see to be except myself? I made it up, here on this bridge between starshine and clay." The words struck a chord deep within him, evoking images of Amina standing defiantly before City Hall, her voice cutting through chaos like a blade. She hadn't chosen her circumstances. She'd simply risen above them, refusing to let oppression define her. When the poem ended, applause rippled through the audience, followed by silence so profound it felt sacred. Daniel closed his eyes, letting tears slide unchecked down his cheeks. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to grieve, not just for Amina, but for everything she represented: resilience, defiance, hope. As the memorial concluded, Daniel lingered near the stage, watching as candles flickered in the night breeze. Someone handed him a match, nodding toward an empty lantern. He hesitated, then lit the wick, adding his flame to the collective glow. Around him, voices rose in song, a traditional spiritual sung in Creole, its melody weaving through the air like smoke. The lyrics spoke of freedom, resilience, and the promise of dawn breaking after darkness. Daniel joined in softly, his voice blending with others until it became indistinguishable from the whole. When the last note faded, he turned to leave, pausing briefly to glance back at the sea of lights. In that moment, he understood something Amina had always known. Justice wasn't a destination. It was a journey. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, each step forward mattered, because dignity wasn't something granted, it was inherent, undeniable, eternal. As he walked away, the city hummed with life, its rhythms unchanged yet somehow transformed. Somewhere in the distance, a trumpet wailed, echoing the heartbeat of a people who refused to be silenced. And though Amina's voice was gone, her echo remained.